Hello, love. Welcome back. Coach Jen and I are back. We're talking about relationships. I love relationships. I love coaching and teaching on it because I don't know, I grew up with like a fairy tale of like thinking what relationships should be. And, of course, my parents were human and they had a human marriage for sure. And then, my friend relationships, I was just like any other girl. Sometimes we were best of buds, sometimes we fought, all the things, right? And then I got into a marriage and then we got a divorce. I mean, all the things. I didn't really understand my part in it. And so today we're going to really dive into the relationship with others because, I said this on the last podcast, but oh man, if you've ever been in a fight with someone, like not talking to them, or maybe you're just arguing, it feels horrible. I mean, talk about ruining your days. I mean, it can cause a lot of stress. And I think there are relationships that people have where they don't really talk to their partner or spouse or friend or family. They've become very disconnected and they just kind of live in this, but it's an underlying like worry and stress. We want to help you with that. Jen and I both have done a lot of relationship work. I like to say I have a really amazing marriage. And the reason why I have a really amazing marriage is because I have done so much work on myself and the relationship with myself. Paul is my partner in this relationship for sure, but he didn't need to change for our relationship to be amazing. And boy, that I always thought, well, if the other person would just change and be this way, it would be better for me. And I have learned something very different. Jen, what's been your experience with thinking that if someone was different, that your life would be better?
It would just solve everything, right? If
Yes.
they would just change, then everything would be sunshine and rainbows because I was just doing all the things. And first of all, I think it takes away your power a bit
Mhm.
when you are putting this idea out there that somebody else needs to change because you're relying on them to take different action, which you can't do anything about. And when you can come back and learn that it's really how you show up in the relationship, right? You get to control that, what that looks like and what that doesn't look like. It takes the pressure off of something that's out of your control anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Because that's the thing, right? We don't have control over others. I mean, I wish we could, but we don't. When we expect people to be a certain way or we, want them to do things. And this isn't, I always like to be clear here. You can ask people for what you want. You for sure can. You can ask for things you want. You can think, well, this is, I would love for you to do this or be this way or whatever. You can, but it's when they don't, how you handle that. We all create rule books for the humans in our lives. And when they don't do that, and again, this is different younger child parent relationship. It's even different adult parent relationship. But I'm talking about like, the majority of our relationships, adult relationships. I think we have these expectations. And I want to give you an example because expectations cause a lot of suffering in life. They really do. When you have low expectations and then something happens that like exceeds your expectations, you're like, oh my gosh, that was the best ever, right? Maybe you go, you see this restaurant on the side of the road and it doesn't look that great, but you're like, oh, I'm starving. Maybe you're traveling and you're like, I'm going to try it out. And then you go in there and it's like the best meal you ever had. Well, you had really low expectations. So you're like, oh my gosh. And then you make a reservation at this real swanky, Michelin star restaurant and they bring out like pebbles for you to eat. And you're like, what? Like, I need to go get a hamburger after this meal. And so your expectations were so high and then, they failed. I think about this. I'm getting ready to have hip replacement surgery and I've set my expectations very low, right? People say to me things like, oh, it's so great. And, I'm like, oh, but what if it's not? What if it takes me longer to recover? What if, it takes me, a year to get my muscle back, all of this. And I want to set my expectations low because if I set my expectations that I'm going to be, running out of the gate at 3 months and that doesn't happen, my brain, my thinking will cause a lot of suffering. And so this happens in relationships. We have these expectations that are set from the outside. Your partner or your spouse should be a certain way. They should treat you a certain way. And again, I always have to say this when I talk about relationships. I'm not talking about abusive relationships. That's not what we do in coaching. That is for counseling and therapy and certified professional health professionals. I'm talking about normal everyday relationships where there is no abuse involved. If you do have that, please get help. You can always email support@beeflightcoaching.com and we can give you resources. But in our normal everyday relationships, we have these expectations because we've watched movies and we've seen the romantic comedies and we've built up these like, well, they should fix me, they should help me, they're going to come save me. And what I find is that causes a lot of suffering, a lot of suffering. And it can be even simple things, well, so and so's spouse, they're going on vacations and my spouse doesn't like to go on vacations. And so you start to create resentments in your relationships, and it all comes from expectations. And it's interesting because when I first talk about this with folks, our brains have a real hard time with expectations because we think certain things and people should do it. And it is one of those things, even for myself, that I have to continually remind myself to like, take a breath on, because the way that I think may not be the way that someone else thinks. And just because someone is doing something, it usually is my interpretation of it. And I'm putting a lot of story in there too. Jen, what's been coming up as I've been talking about expectations and stories?
All the stories we make up. Yeah, I think an important piece is just remembering that, like you said, we each have our own life experiences, our own values, our own things that we were taught. And from that, we have our own perspective. And we have to remember that the people in our relationships also have their own from their life experiences and all of their things and their stories that they've told themselves. And so just because you connect with that person on a certain level doesn't mean that everything's going to align. And so just remembering that there is no right or wrong, right? It is just your right or your way, but it doesn't make it right or wrong. And I think for me, when I could create some like empathy from that thought, that like, oh, I never would have thought of it that way, right? Or I never experienced that in my life. So that wouldn't even cross my mind. And once I started to kind of remind myself that the other people in my relationships are their own person and they're living their life through their perspective, it just changed. Like, there's not just my way, and my way is not the right way, right? Because I think, we unintentionally think that way sometimes when it comes to relationships.
And it's interesting. I find that expectations, the miscommunications in our life come from different expectations that each person has. And it's interesting because someone sees it this way, someone sees it that way. You have different opinions about it. And so you can clash because of the different ways that you're thinking about it. And I think too, we do put a lot of story into things. We put a lot of like our own life experiences and our own hurts into how people respond to us. And so when you think something, you will create it. So when you think someone's going to treat you a certain way, then it's very fascinating how you will find that. If I think Paul's not doing enough around the house, I'll find examples of that. Even though he may be doing 10 things around the house, I'll find the things that I think he should do. And so it's just very interesting how our brain, I mean, we're wired in that way. It's bias. We become very biased and we start to see what we think. And so this work on relationships with others, part of it is starting to know what you think about the other person and what your really overpowering thoughts are. Because if you think something, that's what you will find. If you think someone doesn't love you, then you'll build all the evidence that they don't love you, even if it's not true. Even if they're telling you, no, I love you, like you won't believe it because some part of that is the relationship you have with yourself, but some part of it is because you built all this evidence of why they don't. it's just fascinating to me, actually, this work. And, Jen touched upon something that I don't want to go away from, and that is compassion. She used the word empathy. Being in relationships with others require compassion. You can't control if someone's going to be compassionate, but you can be compassionate. And I think being kind and compassionate to others, because we don't know what other people are going through. We don't know. Sometimes my husband will come home and he'll be really quiet. He's a therapist. And I've just learned that I could think, oh, he doesn't want to talk to me or, whatever. But I don't think that way. I just know, like, oh, he must have had a really tough, he works with teenagers, and some days are just, he experiences really hard things that he has to process. I allow him to have that space. As when I've had a bad day, he will give me that space too, so that we don't, because man, if I would just be like, why aren't you talking to me? Blah, blah, blah. Tell me about your day, and he's not feeling it. I mean, it could be a little fight, right? And so again, I really do think some compassion, some kindness, and some space when it comes to your own expectations of how people should be and what they're thinking. Man, we do create a lot of stories in our brain. I mean, really, I'm not kidding. I've gone down rabbit holes, ladies, where I'm like, they don't like me. They're blah, blah, blah. This is happening, all the things. They're coming to get me. I don't know. Right. Like this whole thing, and then most of the time it doesn't turn out that way. It's not the real reason. And so I think when it comes to relationships with others, it's checking your rule book for this other person and your expectations for this other person. Again, it's not that you can't want things from people or, expect certain things. We'll talk about boundaries in another episode, but it's allowing them to be themselves, to having some compassion and some kindness for the other human. We only know what we know, right? So everyone has had a different experience in this life. This is why what I've gone through, you may have gone through just way harder things in your life. I can't understand what you've gone through because I might not have gone through it. So my experience is limited to what I have experienced. So I can show you compassion and kindness and empathy. Sometimes I think we forget that, and then two, if someone hasn't gone through everything that I've gone through and they're having a rough day where I'm like, oh my gosh, like that would be a good day for me, right? Like for me to have compassion for them because that's their reality too. Jen, any thoughts on that?
For myself, I love to come back to like how do I want to show up in this situation,
Mm.
right? I love to like set a time frame, like, okay, I'm going to be upset for a day, or I'm going to let myself be upset for
Oh
10
yeah.
minutes, whatever it is, because like you said, if not for myself, I've learned over time, yeah, I can fester, right, for days, and it does bring down everything else because that is the constant thought that is going on or the feeling. But I would offer like setting a time limit, deciding ahead of time, and then coming back to like, okay, what is the truth and how do I want to show up in this situation? Because
Yeah.
that's it. That's all that we can control.
Yeah. And as I'm sitting here, Jen's mom texted me a week ago and I have not texted her back. And so this is what Jen's mom could do. Mindy could be like, oh my gosh, Shannon doesn't love me. She hasn't texted me back. But she won't think that. She'll think, oh my gosh, Shannon is so busy. She loves me so
Don't miss
much. She's
me.
going to text me when. And right now I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to text her. We got to meet up this week. So, like, again, thank goodness for people in my life who have kindness and compassion for me, right? Like I need it too. And so I say this because, again, my loves, this work on relationships is complicated. And this is the coaching and the work that we do in Transform Boss because it affects every area of your life. You get in a fight with a partner, a spouse, a friend, your mother, and then the next thing you know, you're in a knee deep, a half a gallon of ice cream, and you've been watching Netflix for 2 days straight. Like, yes, that's how it affects you. And so, what we want to do is help you through that. I loved Jen's question of how can I show up in this situation? And then another question I'll offer to you to ask yourself is, what would love do right now? I love to ask myself that question. Like, if I'm frustrated with someone, or I'm just having a hard time communicating with someone. And I just ask myself, how would love show up in this situation? How can I show love in this situation? And it almost always changes the way that I think about the situation and the person. And so those are our two kind of tips we want to leave you with today. And if you want to do more of this work, go to jointransformboss.com. Come on in, my love. We'd love to have you in. You know, we're coming to the end of the year, and I know a lot is going on in our world right now and probably in your life. And I want to help you live your best life in a body that you love. That's our mission. We help women do that, and we help that with their mental and emotional well being. That's what we do around these parts. Jen, any last thoughts before we end today?
I was just thinking, as you said, like, what would love do? Just how differently when you are met with love,
Oh,
like when you're on that other end, you're like, oh, okay, I can let those walls down, right? Like it just changes so much. And so I just think that that is just such an impactful question.
you know, I have to say, I have to tell a story because I tell you, so I was going through this really difficult time because I lost someone who was important to me. I was a coworker, and it was just a very tragic situation, very sudden loss. And I was helping a lot of people through it, supporting a lot of people as a leader, as I am. And I got on the phone with someone and was talking about, kind of, this is what we do, when folks pass away, right? You go into like the logistics, all the things, all the support, all the things we got to do. And she just stopped and she said to me, she's like, Shan, how are you doing? And I'm not, she's like, I've just been thinking about you and I just want you to know, like, how are you? Like, and it was so, I just started to cry because it was so impactful. Her compassion towards me in that moment was she didn't want to hear about all the other people and all the other things and all of these. She just wanted to hear about me. And it just meant the world to me, honestly. I don't know, maybe forever I'll always have this special place for her because she just took that moment of compassion when I really, really needed it. And so I love that you said that, Jen. It's so good, right? Mm. I appreciate when I'm on the, the other end of it. I do try to give it a lot too, but
You
man,
do all the time.
I do really like being on the other end too. Well, my loves, I hope you have a beautiful couple weeks as we go into October. Right? The next time we'll be here will be end of September, October. And I tell you, ladies, we're going into the end of the year. Let's go. This is not time to like power it down, power it up. Like, oh, ladies, let's have the best end of the year. Like right now, like just commit. I'm gonna have the best end of the year I've ever had. Yeah, let's go. All right. I love you, Jen. Thank you so much. Oh, you're wonderful. I'm a beautiful co-host, and we'll see you ladies soon. All right. Bye, my loves.